We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Welcome back, dear listener. We're back again, the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast. A pretty full crew on this evening. The room's full, but we're socially distant appropriately because it's a large room. So don't call in the paratroopers, please, because we've seen them at work in Victoria and they've got a pretty heavy hand.
It can be brutal.
I'm Trevor, a.k.a. the Iron Fist. This is a podcast where we talk about news and politics and sex and religion. Joining me, as always, is Scott the Velvet Glove.
G'day, Trevor. G'day, Paul. G'day, Joe. G'day, listeners.
And Paul the 12th Man.
Greetings, Earthlings. G'day, gents.
And lurking over the mixer and the sound equipment is Joe the tech guy, who will keep an eye on that so I don't have to. And welcome again, Joe.
Evening, everyone.
And if Joe suspects that we're talking shite on something, he'll chime in and chip in as well. So, right. Gentlemen, I haven't got it on the list, but just the heavy-handedness of police is pretty shocking, some of the scenes that we've seen.
In Victoria, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke last week about the woman who was handcuffed in her pyjamas, like really unnecessary.
Totally.
And then there was a scene of a guy who was some sort of
Schizophrenic
mental
or something,
illness who just stomped on his head.
Yeah, that was totally uncalled for, wasn't it?
After everything we've seen.
He was on the ground already with a bunch of police on him.
Yep.
And this one copper takes it upon himself to kick him in the head with his boot, well, under his boot, you know.
And clearly he'd been running around and giving them a hard time. But, like, you could put you... Like, when I saw it, I thought, for sure this guy has a mental illness.
He's having an episode.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, you've got to have some...
A little bit of compassion.
And he wasn't waving a gun around or an assault rifle. And, you know, if you're a police...
but he did hit one of their cars. Don't forget that.
Yeah. And if you're a policeman, you should be able to tackle and subdue...
Wouldn't you think?
...somebody of an ordinary frame. Like, you know...
It gets back to training, doesn't it? And look, temperament as well. And I recall that incident several months ago where a copper in Sydney, you know, threw this teenage kid to the ground face first, you know, swept his feet from under him. You remember that one?
Yes.
This kid was giving the copper some lip, you know, and basically, you know, saying, "Come on, mate, I'll have you," or whatever.
Yeah.
The copper walked around and swept his feet from underneath him and slammed him into the ground face first. I mean, if police don't have the temperament to be able to take a little bit of lip from a cocky teenager and just manage it, you know, in a normal human fashion, apart from, you know, acting like a thug human, then they're in the wrong profession.
Or they need to be sent off for re-education.
No, they really need to be in a different line of work because they're dealing with people every day and inevitably they're going to have to deal with people who are uncooperative or even provocative. Yeah. Now, if they don't have the temperament to handle that day after day, year after year, they're in the wrong line of work.
The wrong line of work.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
It's quite shocking. But actually, while we're still on that, and again, I didn't put it on the notes, but you know the scene in America where the guy was arguing with the police, he was walking away from them, and he opened the door to his own car, and there were his own kids in the back seat, and the police shot him 7 times. And we all look at it and we go, that's just terrible. But I was listening to Sam Harris on this one, and you know, I've fallen out of love with a lot of commentators over time, but not Sam Harris. I'm still with him. And he said, if you actually look at YouTube videos of police incidents, the number of times that somebody will reach into their car, turn around and shoot a policeman is too often.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah, but there's a difference between squeezing the trigger once and squeezing it 7 times.
I agree with you there. But it is one of those things where you've got to always put things in context of the culture where you are. Like clearly that in Australia would have been unacceptable. Totally. But you have to have a modicum of... It's a terrible thing to say, but there... More than once and lots of times, somebody will reach into their car, pull out a gun and boom, And they've
Yeah,
got
I know
you.
that, but
And-
the cops are also armed with tasers.
Yes.
They could have
Yes.
shot him with a taser
Yep.
just to get his attention.
and I'm not saying it's...
Taser
it's
won't necessarily stop someone with a gun who's determined to use it, though.
No, I know that, but you can tase the bloke first. If he still doesn't stop, then you've got time to deploy a lethal weapon.
Yeah.
You know.
Anyway, it just made me stop and think, okay, maybe not quite as clear-cut. Like, it still seems, of course, over the top, but in context of the American experience, it's a crazy place over there. So,
And, someone we both like, Trevor Coleman Hughes, has written about this and spoken about it. And he said, look, the reality is for a policeman in a city like New York or probably a number of other American cities, he said the reality is that the people that they come across that are engaged in criminal activity are very often black people, black men and Hispanic men. And he said the reality for the police is that's always in the back of their mind. And he's speaking as a black American guy, and he said, he can sort of understand that police are a little bit edgy when they encounter somebody.
yeah, but it doesn't even matter whether they're black or white.
No,
Just the
it doesn't.
chances are of a weapon.
Absolutely.
So
And
in
they
Aus-
do get shot.
So in Australia, you could say, you could let the guy almost drive off. We've got his number plate. We'll go and pick him up in an hour's time from his house. But over there, the chances are he could just reach in and shoot you, and that's happened on a number of occasions. Just puts a different perspective on it. So,
And we know a certain number of cops get killed every year in America.
So anyway, glad I don't live there, and I think anybody who has a chance to get out, why wouldn't you? So some friends of ours, their sister is from Canada, has been living in Canada, like married a Canadian guy and got kids and whatever, has decided to pull up stumps, come back to Australia, join their mother in Tasmania. So they flew into Sydney, 2 weeks quarantine, then flew from Sydney to Tasmania.
2 more weeks.
Another 2 weeks quarantine.
Really?
Yeah.
4 weeks quarantine.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So you've got to be committed if you want to do it. But to get out of that country, I think it'd be worth it. Well, to get out of the States. Canada's a nice place, but yeah. So anyway, just quickly on Victoria, the numbers are coming down. So
I think it's proof positive that lockdowns work. There's no arguing with the numbers. The numbers have fallen, and they've fallen quite dramatically.
when we were having discussions about...
Sorry, correlation does not equal causation.
Here we go.
When we were having discussions about do lockdowns work, and we were trying to find countries that were similar so that the only thing different between them was whether they had a lockdown or not, and trying to use that as a best means of comparing. Well, I forgot to look at the situation where you've got a country that has a lockdown, stops a lockdown and restarts a lockdown. So the only thing different happening in the community is the lockdown. It's probably one of the better sort of methods of determining. And
Victoria's also gone to mandatory mask wearing, which I think would probably be useful for all of us on the eastern seaboard.
yes.
Would you be willing to pay a fine if you stepped out of your home and a cop walked up to you and said, "Where's your mask?" and you said, "Oh, I forgot to put it on."
Well,
There's
that's
your
no problem
fine.
at all. Really? You've broken the law, so you've got to be fined.
Come on, Scott.
You're going to be fined if if the law says you've got to wear a mask outside your home and you walk out without a mask on, then you get fined.
Jesus Christ. We're hurtling headlong towards an authoritarian state with, if the rest of Australia followed what's happening in Victoria, Jesus, you'd be mad to step outside your home,
Well, it's interesting, the debate around Dictator Dan and
Chairman Andrews.
yeah, all that sort of stuff. And I think and as I mentioned last week, I've started following Sky News on Facebook. And
Taking one for the team, are you, Trevor?
I am. And it astounds me I shouldn't be surprised, but I am. My eyes pop open at the vitriol that comes out of these guys, like really nasty, abusive comments about Daniel Andrews and anybody of Labor persuasion, and even Liberals if they dare to be a little bit leftish along the way. Like, it's nasty stuff. And when you look at the comments section, and everybody has been riled up and they're rabid in these comment sections. So it's hardly surprising that our chief medical officers are getting death threats.
But those sorts of death threats, let's face it, they're a dime a dozen these days, aren't they? Everybody gets death threats. I'm surprised we haven't had death threats. But I mean, and I'm not saying that's all right. But my point is
how common do you think they are?
Just about every celebrity gets death threats for.
Yeah, but I do think
Do
that
they?
the cops would actually not
threats.
put her under 24-hour protection unless they were seriously concerned about her safety.
And that's probably quite appropriate. I give you that. But I don't think we should overcook these death threats because a lot of them are just hot air, just people blowing off hot air, you know. I'm not saying that she shouldn't be given appropriate, police.
I think celebrities might get stalked by people who want to,
Lots of them get death threats and rape threats and all kinds. Yeah, from crazies. There's lots of crazies out there, Trevor. You should go out and have a look sometime.
I don't know how many death threats are going on. We'll never know. Nobody's done a study of death threats.
We can't measure it, can we?
Exactly. But from what I'm observing, and the plural of anecdote is not data, and what were the other things that we came up with? But anyway, a lot of nastiness in those comment sections in places like Sky News.
Not only in Sky News, let's face it. The Guardian has plenty of pretty, tough comments about the people that get on the wrong side of the writers in The Guardian.
I would say it's a whole nother level of nastiness. That would be my impression. And I invite the dear listener to look at both and decide what.
Okay. Invite the dear listener to read The Guardian's section where the more radical left writers lurk. And there are a few of them. The Guardian has some very good writers. I'll give them that. There are some very decent writers in the Guardian, but there are also some pretty hard left types as well, and they don't hold back.
Yeah. Well, my impression is when you look at it, it's a particular level of nastiness, and we'll get onto it in a moment with Sky News. But before we do, and we finish with lockdowns, I do want to say. Just in relation to lockdowns, I mean, you might say that they're not worth the economic cost, and you might say that they're not worth the lifestyle cost, and you might say that other measures are better, or, you could come up with all these things, but I think it's pretty clear that lockdowns, even though you may not like them, actually reduce infection rates.
So does the atomic bomb.
Yeah, and so you could say that. Other things work in addition, you could say that. But you can't really get beyond the point that stopping people from interacting stops the spread of a virus.
It does.
But what I reckon people who are sort of in the anti-lockdown brigade or whatever, where they can sort of find something to hang on to, I think, is what's happening in Sweden. Where
that's very interesting, isn't it?
Where they've had a large wave of that came in and an excessive number, a lot of deaths. Yeah. But it does seem now that what we thought herd immunity might need 60%. Here's the thing from the Australian. Up to now, there have been 5,838 deaths. In per capita terms, the fifth highest death rate in Europe, behind only Belgium, Britain, Spain and Italy. But it has also fallen substantially since the northern summer. Only 7 people died with the disease in the past week. So it does seem to be that if you're prepared to accept a heavy hit in a wave, then the herd immunity and death rate might not be as bad. That's sort of based on what's going on in Sweden. So for the people who want to argue against lockdowns and things, well, there's one area you could make some arguments, but it does require you to accept the knocking off of a lot of people in an initial wave.
And that is, I think, something that Australia has not would not be prepared to accept because we haven't been through that first catastrophic death wave that Sweden has been through.
Yes.
It's not just the deaths. The question is the long-term
Exactly, and
suffering.
that's something we don't know about.
Yes,
we
but-
don't know what the long-term impacts of this disease are.
But every disease has side effects and other
Yeah,
long-term effects.
but,
It's
you
not
know,
just
not,
COVID.
not in the same way that
Well, I don't think that's true, Joe.
flu you recover from. This the way it attacks the
It attacks every organ in the body.
Okay, but I heard a doctor talking today, and he was saying he was a British doctor, I think, and he said something like, I think it was less than half of the normal number of cancer diagnoses had occurred because, for whatever reason, people were staying away from hospitals to avoid getting COVID, or they assumed the hospitals would be too busy to take them, or whatever. And he said that will actually translate into several thousand more premature deaths from cancer.
But the problem with that argument is that if you remove lockdowns, the same thing still could happen. People will voluntarily not go out for their cancer test.
Quite possibly.
So it doesn't actually... It's
But-
like the economic issue. By opening up and removing a lockdown, still people have an inherent propensity not to go out. So you will still find people don't go for their breast cancer screenings and things like that.
That may be true, Trevor, but I would assume people would be less likely to stay away from the hospital if the government hadn't sort of incited great panic in the population
See,
by imposing a
they
lockdown.
might be more likely to stay away from a hospital and their breast screening test if they perceive that this is out of control. Like it's arguable either way. It
We
doesn't.
can speculate all over the shop, but
That's my point. Is there's no, it's not actually clear that by removing a lockdown you fix that problem.
well, yes, but I mean, his point was that the lockdown had precipitated a dramatic drop in the number of
But my argument is
examinations
you
for
could
other
say
diseases.
the virus did it because lockdown or not, the fear of the virus, you could argue, precipitated that. So it could happen independently of the lockdown.
I'm inclined to think that
Won't
the
know.
government lockdown has incited a lot more fear than would have been the case otherwise.
Anyway, if you're in the chat room, say hello. It's good to see you in there, Paul, and other people who are making comments. Keep them coming. I'll keep half
There
an eye
was
on that.
that comment. Could we just go back up there again?
Yeah.
From
Wheat Watcher?
No, the one up here. It's
that one?
Eric V.
Yep.
Is there any evidence they are immune to the virus afterwards, though? That's a very good question, Eric, because you do have that situation, that guy from Hong Kong that has tested positive twice, and he's come back from Europe or something like that, was screened on his arrival back in Hong Kong, found to be positive, and he said, that's ridiculous, I've already had it. So
Yeah. There have been reports of people being
Getting it
cleared
twice.
and seemingly getting it twice.
So I did read that there's thoughts that it was actually a relapse of the original infection.
Right.
So it's remained dormant in them, and something has happened and it's flared up again.
I thought that they had done some genetic testing on his virus and they'd found that it was a different virus strain.
Possibly.
I don't know.
Anyway, look, if you're worried, just take some hydroxychloroquine. Because, according to Sky News and Rowan Dean, editor of The Spectator Australia,
But he doesn't write all the articles. Trevor.
hydroxychloroquine. Dear listener, as I keep mentioning, I've been subscribing to it and listening to their shite, and I'm going to subject you now to 2 minutes and 52 seconds of Andrew Bolt and Rowan Dean. And I apologise for this, but you need to get a grasp of what's happening over there on that channel. Here we go. Hopefully. Is that playing, Joe?
We're going to listen to that.
This
week or-
why is that not playing?
Paul Waper tuning out now.
Right. I know what we need to do. On the mixer, we need to turn up the volume on the
Phone?
on the tablet. Is it up?
What's up?
Wonder why that's not working. Oh, that's annoying. Okay. I'm going to have to leave that. I'm going to have to tell you what he was saying. So, yeah, there you go. You've escaped. It's okay in the chat room. James Cridlin says it's a sign, Trevor. That's right. Look, basically, they both came out really pro hydroxychloroquine. And it was Andrew Bolt's show, so he was interviewing Rowan Dean. And this is what they do on Sky, is they've got all these commentators who just take it in turns to interview each other all the time. So,
And nobody else does that, do they?
they interview panellists on ABC. They get panels of people from all walks of life all the time. But a lot of Sky is people
Interviewing themselves.
interviewing each other on their respective programs. Happens a lot.
Someone made the comment, it's stuck in its echo chamber. Well, I can think of several other programs that are a bit like an echo chamber, can't you? The drum, for one.
Yeah. All I can say, Paul, is from my experience of watching these, though, yes, you can say there's bias on the left programs and there's bias on the right programs.
Everybody has bias.
But I perceive, and I don't have a scientific study to back it up. And
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. But the level of that they go to is something quite extreme. But anyway, hydroxychloroquine, Rowan Dean came on and said, the jury is in. Hydroxychloroquine is proven to be effective in the treatment of COVID, and that the Chief Medical Officer in Victoria should resign in disgrace, and the Chief Medical Officer in Queensland should resign, the Premier Dan Andrews should resign, the opposition health spokesman, Bowen, he should resign. This study that I've got here, and he's waving it in his hands, is a study of studies where these people, well-respected doctors from Rush University in America, have looked at all of the studies of hydroxychloroquine, and they've tallied them up, and the jury's in. Hydroxychloroquine is effective and should be used. And so you listen to that and you go, wow, that's interesting. And I'm really disappointed I can't play that clip because the level of vitriol.
Yes, we want to hear the vitriol.
Yeah, I don't know what I've done there. I don't know why that's... I don't know what... Anyway.
You can always edit it in later.
Yeah, I will. Good point. On the
podcast.
On the podcast, you can hear it. Really? So,
but we won't hear it.
So anyway, he waves
We'll
around the report, and I then had to go onto Rowan Dean's Twitter to see a link for it. The link didn't really send me to the actual report. So then I Googled, and the only place I could find it was on the Palmer Foundation website.
Oh, dear God in heaven.
Which was a link to this article.
Palmer Foundation.
Yes.
He has his own foundation.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And of course, he's very pro hydroxychloroquine because he went and bought all that hydroxychloroquine.
He's gone and bought a whole heap of hydroxychloroquine.
Yes.
Yeah, which he said he was going to make freely available and all that sort of shit.
Well, he is a philanthropist, of
Yeah.
course.
No, he's not a philanthropist. He's
So I've got
saying it.
I've got links here, and I'm just reading the heading. The headline of this study is hydroxychloroquine is effective and safe for the treatment of COVID-19 and may be universally effective when used early before hospitalisation. A systematic review. And from a couple of guys from Rush University. And of course, dear listener, meanwhile, we've got a national COVID-19 clinical evidence task force, and they say, don't use hydroxychloroquine. It doesn't work, and it can cause
all sorts of nasty
side effects.
Yeah.
Don't use it. So I got onto Deep Throat and said, Deep, have a look at these. Have a look at this for me. So, and he did very kindly, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, what it is a 43 studies around the world where they've done some sort of treatment of hydroxychloroquine on people suffering COVID. And this study has looked at those studies and tallied up the results. And so, and they've listed them all, and there's footnotes there that you can then actually go to those individual studies and look them up. I mean, who's got time to do that? Me, somehow. Because I just smell a rat. I think this just doesn't sound right. Like, this just doesn't sound right. So...
It was around before COVID, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was some sort of
Hydroxychloroquine,
malaria treatment or
Yeah,
something.
it's been used as a malaria treatment.
has it?
It's also
and
been
also
used-
for people with
Arthritis. My brother's got
autoimmune.
rheumatoid arthritis, and he's on Facebook saying he's been taking this for 15 years and never had a problem. You know, it's just one of those things that you think to yourself, okay, that's fine, but, you know, it's not, it's already been proven not to be safe.
It's not harmless, and until we prove that it is effective against COVID, the risks of harming somebody are greater than the risks of potentially helping someone.
Exactly.
So, 43 studies.
Should I take back my prescription?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah. 43 studies, and even according to the authors of this report, so they say 27 showed clinical improvement, but 16 showed no improvement at all. So even according to the reading of this study by these authors, you'd say it's got it's not a 100% success rate by any means. So to say that it's proven, even with this study, if you accepted that they're all great studies, still a long way to go before it's proven, with 16 of 43 showing no signs of improvement. So what you need to understand when you're looking at these studies is there are studies and there are studies. So what a lot of these studies in this report are, and I'll go through them just really briefly soon, but most of them are retrospective observational studies where they're basically, after the event, looking at the results of a certain cohort of people in a hospital and then drawing statistics out of that as they see fit. And really, if you're going to try and prove whether a medicine works or not, you need to do it prospectively, where you start at the beginning and sign everybody up, and at that point everybody knows we're signing up for this trial, and you have a placebo, a control group, and you have it randomised, and you have it such that neither the participants nor the medical people involved know who's getting the real thing. That's all kept secret until the end. If you don't do that, then you're not accounting for all sorts of inherent bias and all sorts of placebo effects. So basically, when looking at this study, first of all, it's not peer-reviewed. The authors, there's a Chadwick Podromus, he's the main author. He's an orthopaedic and regenerative medicine surgeon, like he's an orthopaedic surgeon.
How dare he think his expertise would be relevant?
His co-author is a Bachelor of Science on sabbatical. It's a strange thing for somebody with an orthopaedic background, and it seems to have undoubted speciality in fixing ACLs, to suddenly end up in a... It's just odd. Like, alarm bells should be ringing. For somebody like Rowan Dean, if you're going to go on the TV and say, this is the proof, the jury's in, and the people you're relying on is an orthopaedic surgeon and a guy in a gap year, like, shouldn't you at that point say, I better look into this a bit more carefully?
One would have thought so.
You would have thought so. So I spoke to, as I said, to Deep Throat, and let me just see what he said, that a quick perusal, basically most of them were retrospective observational studies, and when you look at them, there were only really 3 genuine ones with any numbers that were randomised, controlled with placebo, and those were the ones that showed absolutely no benefit from hydroxychloroquine. So the rest were just rubbish studies. Some of them were 50 people, some of them 60. To give you an example of one of them here, so this is one of the studies that he's relying on. Long-term care facilities in New York looked at 54 patients, gave them hydroxychloroquine, observed the recovery. So of the 54, 6 were transferred to acute care hospitals and 3 died. And in this study, they then compared that to the morbidity rates of a long-term care facility in Washington, not New York, a completely different state, just looked at the morbidity rate and said, well, these guys here in New York did better, so hydroxychloroquine works. And that was counted as one of the ones to prove that hydroxychloroquine works. So
It's really nonsense, wasn't it?
complete nonsense. And the vitriol that he came out with, saying all these people should be resigned, it's a complete disgrace. He's clearly got an overwhelming agenda happening here with this.
Maybe he just likes sounding off, you know?
But I don't understand what the agenda would be. I mean, what possible advantage is for him to go on Sky News ranting and raving about hydroxychloroquine? I mean, is he a shareholder in the company that produces hydroxychloroquine?
Isn't it more about showing the people who are saying that it's useless, the public health specialists up as idiots? It's more about undermining the status quo.
Yeah, good point.
Possibly.
There's a sort of an anti-intellectualism
Absolutely,
in a Trumpish sort of way. And these guys are actually really pro-Trump on this channel. Like,
How could they be?
Just, indeed. How? But, yeah, really pro-Trump. So,
Some of the listeners are going to think I'm pro-Trump now because I said that, right?
who knows? Do you want to put in a disclaimer? So, anyway, if you listen to the actual recorded podcast, I'm going to slip in the words of Rowan Dean, and you get a feel for just the nastiness that he uses when he's
Losing it.
yeah. And you say, oh well, he just likes sounding off, but I mean,
Put some people in front of a TV camera and just they let it rip.
and you're welcome to do that, Rowan, but it just means you've lost all credibility. Why would anybody trust anything you say in the future about anything? And you couldn't. If he's referred to something, you'd have to go, well, now I've got to refer to the source material because I've lost faith in you. And that's my point a little bit on this, is it's really hard now to know where the truth is on topics. Shutdowns. Like COVID has really exposed that we've got people who would normally appear to be experts in a relevant field saying completely the opposite to other experts in the relevant field. Like, we are getting epidemiologist type people coming out with things quite different to what
The chief medical officer is saying, for example.
Well, you
yeah,
said
yeah,
last
yeah,
week that epidemiologists were a dime a dozen.
Yeah. So,
Well, that's what Trevor said.
did I
last
say that? Or
Yeah.
jokingly, maybe?
You're saying it jokingly, I
Right.
think.
So it's just getting really difficult to... You can't accept... Well, and of course, looking at the comments again on this Facebook page, of course, nobody's got time to read this report and delve into it and examine it. And you also need a certain level of skill to be able to understand statistics to some extent, to sort of work it out. Some of it's sort of obvious as common sense, but it's a matter of time. And you've just got to try, dear listener, find sources that you can trust, and because you don't have the time to do this. It's really hard for people, I think, now to find
And that's the
reliable
job
sources.
of the TV commentator, supposedly,
Well,
is to check their sources and make sure what they're saying has some validity.
yeah, but we know we can't trust TV commentators. We know we can't trust many journalists, there's only just a handful that you can say, you'll trust what they say is true. It's really difficult that you've got to go to the source material on all these things or throw your hands up saying you don't know.
Generally, the public health officials, it's not one epidemiologist on their own. It's actually a group, and it tends to be there will be on anything an outlier in a group of experts. And rather than listening to the outlier, it's listening to what the majority of the group of experts think.
Yes, you're right. I should take that back in that when you've got a like we do with our health professionals on this, you have to be able to trust our health people on this sort of thing.
You'd like to.
Yeah. And if there is a study presented that says they're talking complete shit, you really probably need to look at that study first and go, let me read the fine print, because you have to have as a starting point our professional health people are doing the right thing. But there's lots of things in life outside of that where it's getting really hard to tell where does the truth lie on stuff. So,
well, I think that you can listen to your chief health officers in each of the states. You can listen to them and that sort of thing because I think they are telling the truth as close as they can get to it.
But
They're telling the truth as they understand it.
Well, yeah. But
nobody has access to absolute truth, do they? So
No, they
I mean, it is relevant to listen to dissenting voices too.
Well,
The
you
problem
can
is-
listen to them, but you shouldn't ever you shouldn't put too much faith in what the dissenting voice says.
and there's a limit
Because-
to how much dissenting voice, the time taken to deal with each dissenting voice, it can be extraordinary. Like they can it's easy to throw up
But
red herrings and rubbish, and it takes.
Why would you believe anybody 100%? You wouldn't, would you?
No. So we see this often with the anti-vaxxers, with the doctor who happens to be, a back surgeon or whatever, holding forth about epidemiology, and the problem is, they may be raising valid points, but none of us have the expertise to be able to verify that. You have to have a relevant knowledge in the fields to even begin to understand whether they're talking crap or not. And that's the problem. Really, these debates should be held in professional forums amongst people who understand, and then we accept the output of the professional forums rather than the argument being held in the free press, because the majority of us have no clue what half these terms mean, let alone the possible confounding influences.
Bob Woodward's, he's got himself into trouble because he was interviewing Trump and all that sort of thing, and he apparently knew back in February that it was airborne and that Trump said it was a hell of a lot worse than the seasonal flu. And he's got himself into trouble because he didn't report that immediately. Now, there's a lot of people saying, well, had Trump had said go out and wear masks immediately, rather than what the CDC was saying at the time, because the CDC was saying, no, don't go out and buy masks. Keep those masks for the frontline people and the professionals. I could understand the CDC saying that at the time, but once they'd got their masks and everything, once they got their mask production and everything up to date, then the CDC should have actually said, well, we've had to change our position on masks. It is a good idea for you to start wearing masks.
Yeah.
Isn't that what they did? Wasn't it kind of once they had enough masks, then they said
That's probably
go
what
for
they
it?
did say then. But
Which slightly undermines people's trust in them then, doesn't it?
it does slightly undermine them. But, what were they to do? Were they supposed to say, yeah, everyone go out and buy a mask and then you're not going to have anything in the hospitals,
So they were deliberately deceptive, and now you're saying people should understand that they were deliberately deceptive for a very good reason.
They were overly
Absolutely.
simplistic.
Well,
They didn't tell the whole story.
Well, they didn't tell the whole story, but this was based on Donald Trump's conversation with President Xi, who said that it is airborne. Everyone else at the time was saying you got to wash your hands and all that sort of stuff because you got to be keeping an eye on what you're touching. They didn't really know until a month or so into it that it was airborne. So that's where it's come from, but. I do take your point, though, Paul. I can understand what you're saying, that they were being deliberately deceptive. Yes, I suppose you could actually say that they were being deliberately deceptive while they were getting their PPE and manufacturing up to speed?
There's also the confusion. People think that the masks protect them, and they don't. They
It just stops you from
infecting.
spreading it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They stop you infecting other
They
people.
don't give the wearer any protection at all?
No.
Zero.
Oh, they may provide some, but very little. So the N95s, the stuff the hospitals wear, but the face masks, no. It's all about stopping the spread of all, moisture particles.
Aerosols, yeah.
And that's more about stopping you from spreading it rather than protecting you from other people.
So anyway, when we've got death threats against the Chief Health Minister, I think guys like Rowan
Not
Dean,
minister,
Chief Health,
health
Officer, I think guys like Rowan Dean
Probably
have got a percentage of responsibility in that sort of thing,
Absolutely.
because they're really violent in their talk about how disgraceful it is that we're being deceived by these people. They should resign in disgrace, and really whipping people up into a frenzy. So I think guys like this have got a lot to answer for, and bloody Sky News, and it's just going to tear this country apart.
I could say the
this sort of
same
stuff.
about other journalists and other stories, Trevor. I think I agree with you. Journalists should exercise a level of responsible, behaviour in terms of how they couch what they want to say.
You've got
But when you're saying they're speaking violently, you're starting to sound like some of these hard leftists who say, words are violence, which it isn't true. Let's be real.
I think there's a link between the way he talks and the sort of whipping up of people into a kind of hysteria. And
Not like our government whipping up hysteria by calling an emergency in the state of Victoria, for goodness sake.
I mean, when you look at the comment pages, you then are not surprised to hear that there are death threats, because when you read things like, that bitch has got no heart, and they're just fooling us. They're not listening to the real scientists. It's all a conspiracy. It's these sorts of things that he's feeding are dangerous.
I agree. It's low quality journalism,
Yes.
and why does he have a job if that's his style? But
Because his owner is happy for that.
who's his owner?
Murdoch.
Oh,
He's-
the evil genius,
Yeah.
Rupert Murdoch.
You don't think he's an evil genius?
I don't think he's a genius. I think
Oh, he's a genius.
He's
He's even an evil genius.
he's a clever businessman for sure. Genius
he's
is a
taken
word I don't use that freely.
he's taken a suburban newspaper in Adelaide.
Yeah, but he inherited it from his freaking father.
You inherit a suburban newspaper in Adelaide and end up in his position
Well, he's a
now,
good-
and
He's a competent businessman for sure.
And basically, he decides in the Western world, US, Australia, the UK, who gets elected. I mean, you don't get elected without enormous luck unless you're in favour of Rupert Murdoch. It's just the way it
He has
works.
influence for sure.
So anyway, a dangerous practice, and so in the past, I've been complaining about your Spectator articles.
You have.
Yeah.
Unfairly, I would say.
And Rowan Dean is the editor of the Spectator Australia. And I think
He doesn't write the articles.
But what does an editor do?
Oh, come on, Trevor. I read from a range of different journals, including The Guardian, including the ABC, including the Sydney Morning Herald, sometimes the Australian if I can get access to it, but I don't pay for that one. And I judge an article by what I'm reading, not by who owns, or who is the general editor. I judge it by the content.
But here's my point: is what does an editor do except set the tone and the direction of the publication?
Well-
isn't that what an editor does?
Okay, so the editor clearly of The Spectator, for example, thinks it's okay to criticise both Corbyn and Boris Johnson because that's what they do. They criticise everybody. And that's what I like. I like a journal that is not afraid to criticise any politician, any famous person from whatever party, and that's exactly what they do.
I don't think they criticise the right in
What
the
is the
Spectator.
right? What is the right?
The
Boris
only-
Johnson? Do you think
Well, let's
Boris
talk about
Johnson?
Australia for just beginners
Okay.
with Rowan Dean as the
You don't
editor.
think you've never read anything in the Spectator criticising the Australian government?
I couldn't say. Well, for a start, I don't subscribe, so I can't read all of the articles. But I can. The ones you sent, that I get to see is my sample,
Yeah.
and I
I'll
also
send you more.
And you can see snippets and headlines and sort of gather from that what's likely the article is about. And here's my proposition: is that with Rowan Dean as the editor of the Spectator Australia, he would set a tone and he would tell his journalists the sorts of things that he wants in his newspaper.
I don't think it works like that, frankly.
What does an editor do then?
Well, I don't know exactly what an editor does, but having read The Spectator for some period of time, I just cannot see one person's mind in all the different articles. I just can't see it. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm blind, but I've seen lots of... I originally subscribed to the British Spectator, not the Australian one, and then I discovered, I can get access to the Australian one too. And but anyway, I started off reading the British one because I was interested in what was going on in the UK and Europe in general. And guess what? They criticise everybody over there. And that's the way it should be. That's good journalism. Hold everyone to account. That's what I like.
If only that was the case.
It is the case.
The Spectator Australia, well, we'll have to do a study. I'll have to pay for a month's subscription and tally up what I consider to be a pro-right or a pro-left article and see what it tallies up to.
Forget about pro-right and pro-left article.
Would that have any meaning?
Why not judge each article by its content rather than whether you think it's pro-right or pro-left? Pro-right or left it's nonsense. It's this sort of binary thinking that, people think I'm on the good side or I'm on the bad side, It's
when
silly.
When it comes to trust, we don't have time to look at the sources of everything we read.
That's why we get educated, isn't it? That's why we have university education so that we can develop our, critical faculties.
But my point is a university-educated person could hear Rowan Dean on Sky News saying the jury's in, hydroxychloroquine is proven by this study to be effective, and they would go, oh, okay.
Yeah, some would, I agree.
So because they don't have the time. So it's about whether you can trust an organisation, and I think he's setting... So from my observation, I'd say that the Australian and the UK Spectator are very biased. It looks to me like the US version is not nearly as biased,
They're
which
all
is interesting.
biased. Everything is biased, Trevor.
course,
the Guardian is biased. The ABC is biased, for goodness sake.
Of course they are, but you can't actually trust even the facts of a Rowan Dean. Like when he tells you, here's a report that says X, and in fact it says Y, that's more than just bias. If he gives an opinion and he says, in my opinion, the Labor Party is shit and the Liberal Party are great, you can go, well, okay, that's your opinion. I hear it's an opinion. I judge whether I want to believe that opinion or take it on board. But when you're pulling out facts and you're saying this report says X and in fact it says Y, that's when I have a real problem. And you have to really, with that sort of organisation, say, well, I can't trust you.
And you obviously don't.
And I'm imploring you not to, is what I'm saying.
Well, look, I want to put your mind at rest. You don't need to worry about me. I'm perfectly capable of making up my own mind.
Right.
So don't worry about me, Trevor. I don't read articles based on whether I think they're right or left. I read them and I assess the content and I think, is that point of view valid? Are those facts believable? I'm not sitting there thinking right, left. That's not the way I operate.
Okay, so...
That's the way Murdoch actually operates.
And look, I just don't accept what you're saying about the editor because I just cannot believe that, all the journalists who work for The Spectator, whether it's Australia or the UK, that they're so docile, such drones for Murdoch, that they just sit there and say, "Oh, what do you want me to write this week, sir?" You know,
Really?
they're not like that. Trevor.
Really?
No, you really give them too little credit for personal autonomy and intellectual integrity.
If you're a journalist and you need to feed your family, and
Here we go. They're all intimidated by their employer.
indeed,
I just don't buy it.
you don't actually believe in, you don't like Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent, do you? You just, you don't agree with that? You don't agree with his thesis?
Look, it's so long since I've seen that book. That was like when I was 20 or something. I came across that book. I don't even remember how much I read of it.
You see, if you're in, say, a newspaper like The Australian, and you start producing work that is against the culture of The Australian, you will find that you don't get promoted and you don't get moved into positions that you'd like to. So you move on to a different newspaper. Or if you're of a type that really wants to write left-wing articles, you don't even apply for The Australian. So to some extent, the editor doesn't have to walk down the room and stop at the desk of each journalist and say, by the way, I need another right-wing article today. But when people give them credit, go, well, the organisation I'm working for has a certain flavour, and if I don't give them the flavour they want, I'm either not going to progress or I'm not going to be around longer.
Look,
that
I
happens,
accept that
Paul.
there's something in what you say.
And Rowan
the
Dean,
general tone, yes.
And Rowan Dean would be setting a tone in the Spectator Australia in line with his hydroxychloroquine rubbish. And if you're not prepared to work within that tone, you wouldn't be there.
I haven't read anything about hydroxychloroquine recently, but I've read quite a lot of other articles, and I didn't get the feeling that Rowan Dean was standing over their shoulders as they wrote.
Okay, so you posted an article by this Declan Mansfield about Black Lives Matter and comparing them to the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And
it was a good article, wasn't it?
So did you think it was?
I really did, yes. And I was a bit shocked that you thought it was so aberrant.
Right. So what Black Lives Matter shares with the Nazis is an economic philosophy that is essentially socialist.
No, it was a bit more than that, Trevor. What did he say? It has reintroduced race into politics in a way not seen since Nazism. Dead right.
It's introduced. Look, I'm not going to quibble with every word in the article. I'm not for a minute.
Well, which one are you quibbling with?
Well, I just told you what Black Lives Matter shares with the Nazis is a worldview that blames others for real or imagined justice, an economic philosophy that is essentially socialist.
Well, that's true.
The Black Lives Matter.
The founders of Black Lives Matter are publicly in favour of a sort of Marxist state.
Black Lives Matter as a movement is not. People aren't marching in the streets with Black Lives Matter with a socialist agenda.
Yeah, but he was talking about the core of the movement, I believe, rather than all the other people out in the street marching for racial justice.
He's talking about the movement. Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, the movement founded by three
if he
black
wants to
American
talk about
women.
the leaders, he should say the leaders. But he's talking about the movement and saying it's essentially socialist when it's just a movement of people who are observing police violence and they're out in the street protesting against it. Like, it's got nothing to do with an economic philosophy.
But it has a lot to do with a racial philosophy, doesn't it?
It's got race in there, and I'm okay on that.
Really?
Yes, of course. I'm okay with his argument that what the fundamental flaw in Black Lives Matter is it has accentuated racial differences rather than brought people together as a class.
Right. Yes.
And that's the whole point, is Black Lives Matter is actually anti-socialist because rather than addressing the problems of society as a class, which would be socialism, it's actually addressing it via racial subgroups. So it's actually the opposite of socialism.
But you're
in
saying
that sense.
are you suggesting socialism is the only solution to, human social inequity?
No, I'm not. But what I'm saying is that by drawing in a sort of Black Lives Matter, a socialist,
I think you're getting a little bit obsessed by that one word, because the rest of the article is about basically the racialized element of the article. Did you read the rest of the article?
I did.
Look, here's another line. What Black Lives Matter shares with the Nazis is a worldview that blames others for real or imagined injustice. An economic philosophy. Yeah, that's right. You read that.
But hang on. What the Nazis was about was just a power grab.
It was a bit more than that, Trevor.
Well, it wasn't.
Yes, it was. It was a whole lot more than just a power grab. Come on.
It's a power grab.
The Nazi regime was just about a power grab.
Absolutely, it was.
Oh, come on.
It threw out
That's
the,
so simplistic.
It threw out the Weimar Republic to take control of the country. Now, the Jews were a scapegoat for Germany's problems.
Yes.
So they picked on them.
That's right.
And they also attacked unions and trade unionists, and they also attacked liberals and communists and socialists. Now, that is
They just attacked anyone who was in the way.
Yes,
The
but it
power
wasn't
group
just
of the-
about
of the
getting
power
power.
grab.
It was about implementing a socio-political agenda is what it was about.
led to them gaining and maintaining power.
It was a lot more than just about power.
Oh
Scott.
no, I think it was all about power.
You should read more about
The final solution
because
was carried
that's
out.
just simplifying it to a ridiculous level.
You
I'm
got
sorry.
to simplify everything down to a.
No, you don't.
You do have to simplify everything down.
Why?
Because if you don't simplify it down, if you always say that there's always this myriad of
So
excuses
the
and that sort of thing.
numbskulls can understand it.
Well, there's also that, but you've also got to simplify things so that you can understand where it's come from.
That's too simple. It was about a lot more than just getting power, Scott. Hitler was obviously a power-obsessed megalomaniac, yes,
yeah.
but it wasn't just about power. He had a vision. I mean, a distorted and bizarre vision for most of us now, but he had a vision of creating this sort of, Aryan utopia. It was a lot more than just
he was a
getting power.
nationalist, so he wanted power
Exactly.
for himself and his people.
Yeah, he was a kind of racial nationalist.
But it wasn't a version of socialism.
I didn't say it was.
Well, that's what this guy is saying in this article.
There are elements of socialism in it, let's be real.
Like what?
In the
Like
Nazis or in
putting
Black
people
Lives
to
Matter?
work. In the Weimar Republic, my understanding is they had massive unemployment and social dysfunction. He put people back to work. I'm not singing the praises of Hitler, don't get me wrong.
That's capitalism, putting people
But
to work.
he did put people to work. He did get industry happening again. He created a new car, the Volkswagen, which we all know and love, and built autobahns across Germany. He got people working again, and that's probably why, for a few years at least, and until he started invading other countries, probably most Germans thought he was doing a decent job.
Yeah, but those autobahns were used to transport troops across.
They were used
Germany.
for everyday things.
I know, they were
Scott.
also
Come on, they
used
weren't
for
just used to
everyday-
transport the military.
Well,
Normal Germans were driving along them every day,
yeah, but what was the car ownership rate like in Germany?
I have
at the
no
time?
idea.
It was probably not anywhere near what it is
But he
now.
did build the Volkswagen specifically
I know,
so
Volkswagen's
that it would
the
be an affordable car for the ordinary German family.
I know, that's why it was called Volkswagen, which means
Exactly.
people's car.
Exactly.
It
Does that not sound a bit socialist to you?
But it was Volkswagen was not government owned. It was a private owned
No,
organisation.
the fact that
Calling
he
something the people's car
produced
by wealthy industrialists does not sound like socialism to me. It's like,
Trevor, you're getting off the track. My point is that cars up until that point were probably on the whole out of the reach of the average working person, right? So he deliberately wanted a car created that was simple and cheap to build so that it could be mass produced and rolled out and sold to the average German working family. Okay? That sounds a bit like socialism to me.
he wanted he wanted capitalist enterprises to build cheap cars. Under that score, Henry Ford was a socialist. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying anything about Henry Ford at all. I'm saying that...
That's the equivalent. That's the equivalent. You're saying Henry Ford's a socialist.
No, I'm not.
Because
I
he
didn't say
designed
that at all.
cars to be used to produce cheap cars for the public so that everybody would have a car. Well, he's a socialist.
You might claim that there's something socialist in that, and I would probably accept that. Henry Ford, did produce cars that were affordable by ordinary people, didn't he?
That doesn't make it socialist.
Doesn't it?
No. Socialism is
government ownership.
Moving capital
socialism
into the
doesn't have
hands
to be all government ownership, does it?
I think it does.
It doesn't have to be all. It doesn't have to be all.
Exactly, and that's my point.
But what could be more capitalist than Henry Ford?
Private enterprise can produce things at a cost that ordinary people can afford.
If Henry Ford is socialist, then anything is socialist.
I didn't say he was.
But the thing you described with the cars is the same.
It was the people's car. It was deliberately designed and built to be accessible and affordable to the ordinary German family. I mean, let's face it, the Weimar Republic...
Commodore was designed that way.
Oh, well, yeah, okay.
Just because to make it sell. That's capitalism.
Capitalism has a role to play, for sure.
Okay, I've got a link to an article.
Capitalism works.
Dear listener,
it produces things.
Just before you go, I can't remember who it was that was writing in this when he was disputing that. But what he said was that with the historic fact that everyone who argues this has ignored is that the key ally was the Soviet Union, and that is a Marxist Bolshevik state. That was what was actually turning on National Socialist Germany.
Sorry, I don't get your point.
Well, the point is that if it was socialism, as this guy argues, then they would never have picked a fight with the Bolsheviks, would they?
Why not?
Can I just quote a bit? I've got an article here, dear listener. You can look at it in the show notes. Matthew Fitzpatrick is Associate Professor of International History at Flinders University. A. Dirk Moses is Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney and the author of German Intellectuals and the Nazi Past. So in this article, I think actually they were looking at this particular article from the Spectator. I can't recall now because it's a while since I wrote these notes. But under Hitler, the party looked squarely to the middle classes and farmers rather than the working class for a political base. Hitler realigned it to ensure that it was an anti-socialist, anti-liberal, authoritarian, pro-business party, particularly after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. The socialism in the name National Socialism was a strategically chosen misnomer designed to attract working class votes where possible, but they refused to take the bait. The vast majority voted for the communist or social democratic parties. A bit further on, for their part, businesses welcomed the Nazis' promises to suppress the left. Hitler and Goering met with a large group of industrialists when Hitler declared that democracy and business were incompatible and that the workers needed to be dragged away from socialism. He promised bold action to protect their businesses and property from communism. The industrialists, including leading figures, Farben, Hoche, Grupp, Siemens, Allianz, and other senior mining and manufacturing groups, then contributed more than 2 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi election fund. Business leadership happily jettisoned democracy to rid Germany of socialism and to smash organised labour. So that's according to those authors. So,
and you think Stalin didn't crush labour unions or totally control them? I mean...
But hang on a second. We're talking about an article in Spectator that is saying Black Lives Matter
I see, yeah. You're referring to this article,
socialists.
Is that right? The one by Fitzpatrick and Moses? Is that the one you're looking at?
No, it wasn't Fitzpatrick and Moses.
Oh,
no,
I'm looking at the wrong one.
So the article in The Spectator by Declan Mansfield that talks about Black Lives Matter are like the Nazis and share an economic socialist philosophy. And
that was just one part of it, Trevor.
No, because
you're obsessed with that particular
line.
line.
Actually, if you read his article, he's trying to basically criticise any sort of collective endeavour. And That's what I objected to. So he caricatured the Black Lives Matter movement into something that it isn't, strawmanned them. I thought it was a terrible article. That's my point. So when you say, "Oh, Trevor, I read articles. I take them on their merits.
Yep.
I don't start with who the editor is or who the newspaper is or whatever." And I go, "Oh, okay, fair enough." But that particular article, I've looked at those particular aspects of it and I've gone, I think that's a shitty article.
You're entitled to your opinion, Trevor.
I am.
And it is just that.
But I've
You're
got good
giving
reason.
an opinion. It's not about facts at all.
True, but I've got some good reasons. So
And others have. He has good reasons for writing it as he did. And, I mean, he makes some other good points. He says, nothing but injustice follows the reintroduction of race into politics, which is what the great champions of racial equality like Martin Luther King, a hero of ours,
Yep.
Nelson Mandela, another hero of ours,
Yep.
knew and tried to instill in their disciples.
if he stopped there, I'd agree with him 100%.
Okay,
if he stopped there, I'd agree with him 100%.
let me just finish this.
Yeah.
Whenever we privilege the collective over the individual, tribe, culture, sex, class, nation or race, injustice in all its dreadful manifestations follows.
Yes, that's...
So you agree with him?
No, I agreed with his first sentence.
You don't agree with that sentence?
No.
Really?
No. Where he goes about where we privilege the collective over the individual, injustice in all its dreadful manifestations follows.
Yes.
We...
The mob. Remember the mob?
No, civilization. Remember it? Like, it's collective behaviour that got us into a civilised society.
Okay.
So
And the collective behaviour of the great inventors and philosophers, they were all working in collectives, weren't they?
Well, when you look at the iPhone, and you
I'm not
look
talking about the iPhone. I'm
You're talking
talking
about
about the European Enlightenment.
you're talking about inventions.
The European Enlightenment, the
Every-
invention of the steam engine, the
every-
invention of electricity.
Every major significant part of the iPhone was actually invented by public universities and public facilities.
I believe
it was
that.
not done through private enterprise. It
yeah.
actually occurred out of the collective.
Yeah.
So
But the iPhone,
so-
let's face it, is just another of myriad products in the modern industrial landscape.
and every inventor built upon the knowledge of the scientists who came before him.
Yes, but, Newton wasn't working in a collective, was he, when he wrote his
But
his
he was
great
standing
works
on the
physics?
shoulders of the
That was a
intellectual
metaphorical
efforts.
statement.
But it's true.
No, he wasn't working in a collective. He was working alone.
But when you...
Come on, Trevor, admit it. Some people do great things by themselves too. Everything great doesn't require a collective.
But this he didn't pluck this out of thin air.
Who?
Newton.
No, of course not.
All of these individual people may have been great individuals.
Yeah, that's a cumulative effect.
Absolutely.
It's not a collective. It's not the same thing.
But working together as a society.
No, it's not a collective. Trevor's talking about groups of people working together as a collective. Newton was not a collective. He was an individual.
You brought up inventions and about how inventions come about through individual endeavour, and I've given you examples in the sense of Apple and in the sense of historical...
I don't consider the iPhone an iconic invention, to be honest.
Okay. So getting back to this article, though, where he says, where we privilege the collective over the individual, that's where he goes wrong. Like he's taken as if collective behaviour is always dreadful. Whenever we
He didn't say always.
He says, whenever we privilege the collective over the individual, and he lists 6 different examples, injustice in all its dreadful manifestations follow. Whenever we privilege the collective.
Okay, maybe that's
this
a
is
bit rhetorical.
Hyperbolic piece of nonsense.
It is a
this.
little bit hyperbolic in that sense.
Yeah.
But his
So-
point still holds true.
well,
we have to be
he's-
aware of collective madness,
No, he's not making a point about...
Well, he is, actually.
Well, if he's...
BLM, that's what he's writing about. He's talking about where mobs of people get together thinking that they're on the side of right and good and justice, and they're doing, they're marching for a good cause. And, a lot of people have made the point we're all against racism these days. How many of us here think racism is a good thing? None of us, obviously. And that's why so many people say, Black Lives Matter, they're marching against racism. Yes, that's something I agree with. And so people go out in the streets and they think they're just marching against racism, which is a bad thing.
Okay.
We all agree it's a bad thing.
So a good article would have pointed these people out as misguided in relying on identity politics, and how the leaders like Martin Luther King focused on equality for all rather than special rights for special groups. But he wants to go further and compare them to the Nazis and this collective endeavour. I just think he goes way over the top.
Okay.
So-
You're entitled to think he goes over the top.
So, in my opinion, it's a terrible article. You think it's a good one?
I think it's a
but
good one because it makes, it brings to light the fact that mobs can be very dangerous.
Well, it doesn't bring to light that. He just says it.
All right.
So,
How can Black Lives Matter be dangerous? I mean, even if you take it to your original, you said it was out there trying to argue against racism.
That's why it's dangerous, Scott.
Okay, so why is that dangerous if they're actually
Because
out there arguing
racism is an abhorrent mentality, an abhorrent attitude.
So what's wrong with them protesting against it?
It's not
Because they're encouraging racialized thinking. They're basically saying it's all about white people, those horrible white people. And, let's be real. Why is it Black Lives Matter, not just Lives Matter? It's a racist organisation.
so that there's a modern way of thinking that says not being racist isn't enough. You have to be anti-racist. You have to examine your every motive. You have to look at everything through through the lens of privilege.
Yeah, that's what they would like us to
And
think.
so, consequently, everything is about race. Nothing can be, a cigar can't be just a cigar. It's very Freudian in its thinking, except instead of it's about sex, it's about race.
Yeah.
So every action you take is a racist action.
Yeah. And you don't buy that, do you, Jim?
No, I think this is not helpful.
That's what I think.
I think this idea of victimhood.
Yes. It's insidious, and it's infiltrating every aspect of our public institutions now. Judges are afraid not to come down on the side of the victim. Oh, for goodness sake! It's all about everything has to be racialised, and this is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. told us not to do. He said, "Take race out of it." And
I agree with that. And I agree with whenever he makes that point in the article. It's the rest of the crap that he throws in there that totally ruins and takes away from what is a legitimate point.
I take your point, Trevor. Maybe that was an ill-judged aspect of the article. I don't agree with you, but I take your point.
I just think that the whole thing about trying to compare the Black Lives Matter movement to Nazism was ridiculous.
Have you read the article?
I have read it, and it didn't make any sense.
None at all?
Well, it made a little bit of sense, but not a hell of a lot of
Hopefully a
sense.
little bit, Scott.
Sorry?
Hopefully a little bit.
I did not take anything from the comparison with Nazism because that was
Okay.
just a nonsense. It made no sense whatsoever.
But did you agree with the part about Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela
Absolutely, yes.
urging people, for goodness sake, don't racialise society? And what are they doing now? And I hear it's bad in South Africa precisely because the ANC, after Nelson Mandela passed on, the ANC very promptly went about racialising everything and giving privilege to black Africans at the expense of white and what they call Cape Coloureds.
Yeah, but when a country is fatally flawed for a long time, it creates inherent problems that are extremely difficult to solve.
Yes.
And you see that in South Africa.
Absolutely.
And you see it in the United States today.
We sure do. And
So-
Black Lives Matter are not helping. They're doing precisely the opposite of what is needed.
What they're doing is understandable, but it would be much better if they were doing the Martin Luther King walk, where they were saying
That's right.
that would be much better.
If we had a Martin Luther King walk in Brisbane, I'd be there.
Right.
Absolutely. But Black Lives Matter, I won't be there. Will you?
No.
Why not?
For the reason that I have an issue with, I see it as divisive, and instead of addressing the real issue of a class battle,
I'm with you on
it is
that.
breaking up the class into little divisions of ethnic groups. So
I'm
that's
totally with you. I mean, people have...
So that's why I won't march with them. But
contemporary
I understand
leftists-
what they're doing, and they don't need to be demonised like.
like as if they're Nazis.
Yes.
Like calling everyone Hitler.
Exactly. And it's all part of this demonising of socialism to try and drag socialism into being Nazism. So if people say, "Oh yeah, I'm in favour of socialism, democratic socialism," people go, "What? You're like Hitler?" Like no, seriously. Well, that's what these
Don't
sorts
they
of
say
articles
you're
are intended.
like Mao or Stalin?
That's what these articles are intended to do. They set a tone that socialism must be Nazism. And Claire Lehman, editor of Quillette, said, "Oh, well, doesn't everybody know that?" Oh, you've got something there.
Well,
She didn't say that?
I think she is unfairly defamed.
She didn't say that.
I mean, somebody in this, and this was an article I came across from I think the notes you sent us.
Right.
And it's a couple of guys who are associate professor of international history at...
Yeah, that's the ones I quoted before.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they describe Claire Lehman as the some sort of poster child of the right, which is absurd. She's not at all right-wing.
Right.
She's a classical liberal. I've heard her speak. Several times, not on YouTube, mind you.
So
not
did she
live.
say that about socialists and Nazis?
No, she's described herself as a classical liberal,
Right,
which is not right-wing.
okay, but they quoted her as saying something. Was that not true?
No, they described her. They didn't quote her. They described
Yeah, they
her.
quoted her.
Did they?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes, I see the part.
What's the quote?
But look,
What's
it
the quote? Could you
says...
just read it?
Okay, it says there've been... Nazism is National Socialism, which is considered a branch of socialism. Claire Lehman, founder of Quillette magazine. And this is the part I object to. Fashionable blog of the right-wing commentariat. It isn't.
I think it is.
Oh, God, Trevor. You're obsessed with everything being right-wing. I read Quillette.
no.
Do you read Quillette? Do you read
little bit,
Quillette, Joe? Does it strike you as right-wing?
I've read the odd article, but I don't read it
I
regularly.
read it regularly.
It's not
And
as
they
right-wing as,
feature
it's
our
not as right-wing
friend-
as Spectator.
Our friend Coleman Hughes,
Indeed.
he's a regular on
Indeed.
Quillette.
Yeah.
You think he's right-wing?
No,
I rest my case.
but I didn't say it. It doesn't have to be all. It doesn't have to be 100%.
I don't think I've ever seen any that I would describe as right-wing on there.
Yeah. So what did she say? Claire Lehman. I thought everybody knew this already.
Oh, well. We don't know if, we don't know if she's being quoted out of context. I just don't know.
Anyway,
But she doesn't strike me as right-wing at all. She strikes me as a very middle-of-the-road classical liberal.
well, I reckon we've probably been going long enough.
Have we? You mean you and I have been going long enough?
1 hour and 27 minutes.
I think so.
Okay.
1 hour and 17 minutes, actually.
Next week, Tibetan sovereignty
Yay.
and the American-Mexican war.
Yeah, liberate Texas.
Yeah, because when you talk about China's aggressive foreign invasions over the centuries, is it mainly Tibet that is sort of your key one? No, what's your key sort of aggressive?
The Han Chinese, who
Yes.
make up 90% of the population, they started in the Yellow River Valley and the Yangtze River Valley. That's their home turf.
Yes,
And over the centuries, they spread out
yes,
and invaded and occupied and controlled literally dozens of minority ethnic areas
right.
around their sort of home
It
base.
reminds me of another group who started off on the Mayflower, and they just sort of spread out in a similar fashion. But that's another story.
How far do you want to go back? you
well,
know?
that's not.
I mean,
that's the point, isn't
this
it?
is the story of human history, isn't it?
Well, that's the point. Is when you talk about the aggressive
Okay.
Chinese foreign sort of...
And surely how you do it counts, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that invading Mexico and taking it by force was a good thing.
Yeah.
But there's no denying that the Chinese have aggressively occupied other people's land.
Right. So this is more an ethnic Han group taking over. How far back is that? Like, is that...
Oh,
is that
thousands of years.
right? Okay.
I mean, it's been a very sort of martial culture for a long, long time, Chinese culture.
Right.
I think that.
Okay, next week for that.
Yeah, okay. I'll hold fire till next week.
Next week.
You've seen Kung Fu Panda, haven't you?
No. Dear listener, got some topics you want us to discuss? Send us an email or send us a message. Send us a voicemail message would be good. Thanks to Steve for the beer.
thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
Steve.
Steve.
That was a very nice drop. We've enjoyed that. Thank you to the patrons who support. Lost a few lately. So if you're thinking of supporting, it would be good. So, yeah. So if you've been listening, 20, 25 episodes, and you're enjoying it, please sign up as a patron because I think Joe's got his eye on some audio equipment.
Never.
Has he?
Yeah. Okay. And we're definitely going to do some Zoom calls next week. I think it'd be good if you'd like to Zoom in and argue something. How about this? Then send me an email with a bit of one paragraph about the concept that you want to argue or discuss, and then we'll put you on a list for tomorrow, for next week. That would be good. And we can Zoom in and have some interaction, see how that goes. That would
And
be
let's not just use the opportunity to attack Paul.
right.
Thanks. Thank you, Scott.
Yes. So ideas, please. So,
Yeah, play the ideas, not the man. Thank
right.
you.
Yep. All right, dear listener, thank you for your attention. Thanks in the chat room for all of your comments. It was a spirited debate yet again.
It
Thank
was,
you,
yeah.
gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in. Bye now.
See you next week.